Greetings, Father Mark signing on, continuing the series on the history of Catholicism in the United States, proceeding in the 20th century, picking up where we left off with the First World War. Now, there's another playlist on this channel. It just covers the modern period. And in that one, I go into much more detail about the military, diplomatic issues and unfolding of the First World War. And that's well, seminarians, you know, because you've already had it. But for those of you who are not, did not take that, did not, you're free to, if that's what you're interested in, then all of it's covered there. But for this one, I'm going to focus on the church, not in the United States, but also in these other countries, because we have Catholics on both sides. So on the Axis side, not the Axis, that's World War II, but the Central Powers, the Triple Alliance. Germany was not a majority Catholic country. However, the southern part of Germany, especially Bavaria and Swabia, did have a majority Catholic population in their areas. And a second, Austria-Hungary, which included many of the what are now separate countries in southeastern Europe. They also had substantial, and Austria certainly was majority Catholic. Hungary was majority Catholic, and others, Slovenia, Bosnia, Herzegovina, was more mixed, but still significant Catholic populations. Whereas on the other side, the United States was not an official. Well, the United States got into it in 1917, but even from the beginning in 1914, France was a Catholic country, and later in the war, Italy would get into the war. And so not only is that a Catholic country, but the Pope lived there too. So many issues, one of which was the relationship of the clergy to military service. What is the service to the church as priest? How closely is that connected, or is it? Is it consistent with their obligations as citizens of their countries? If yes, how far? If no, what? So that's the first issue we'll talk about: military service and religious observance. So, at one end of the spectrum of practices, France, by this point, was since 1905, France officially separated the government from the state, so followed more the American model. Now, France, it's a republic, but it was a parliamentary republic, so it's not exactly like the United States. But it did in this. In 1905, there was official separation of church and state, so the church no longer enjoyed established status as it had for the previous 15 centuries. So, French priests, as well as Protestant ministers, rabbis, imams, if that, I think the number of Muslims in France at that point was, statistically small, but focusing on the Catholics. So there were around just under 80,000 Catholic clergy or priests served as soldiers in France alone. Now, they did not all serve as priests. I mean, they were priests, but they did not all serve as what we would think of as chaplains. Since the separation of church and state, the clergy no longer had the exemption. So they were subject to the draft, and they would not automatically be made chaplains. Now, there were chaplains. So of the 80,000 Catholic clergy in France, 3,101 were priests who served as priests. The rest of that was 79,000 served. They just had to serve in the military, the Army, or the Navy. Seminarians were not exempt. They were just drafted, and had to serve as soldiers, not as clergy. Of the religious, which includes the nuns, 1,517 died. Of the nuns died Now they weren't in combat, but they were nursing it, and they died in the fighting. Whereas on the other, like Austria-Hungary, which was not only majority Catholic, but the church still have established status. Priests were not drafted, so they did not have to fight as soldiers. But they did have clergy, and priests were required. Like every unit had to have its own priest. And the church and state were one on that. So even if a priest, for whatever reason, didn't want to do it, too bad, he had to do it. Italy was another situation like that. Since the unification of Italy under the monarchy, which I also covered in the Modern History playlist in great detail, that occurred in 1860, there was an atmosphere of hostility between the Kingdom of Italy and the Vatican, because the Vatican regarded the Papal States, which the Kingdom of Italy occupied, it regarded that as stolen property. So priests in Italy were also not exempt. They were just drafted. So, for example, a later Pope John the 23rd, he was already an ordained priest by the time the First World War occurred. And he was drafted. He had to serve in the army. Now, not as a priest. I mean, he was a priest, but he was not serving as a chaplain. He actually was in the medical corps. Now, he did obviously offer sacraments, but he did that informally. That wasn't his assignment. In the UK, the United Kingdom, England, England has an established church. The Church of England is an Anglican church, but Catholics live there too. So the UK had and still does an army chaplains department, in which the clergy, since it's established, the established church, the Anglican clergy are civil servants. So that just, they obviously had to do that. By August of 1918, the number of clergy serving in the UK, in the armies of England, numbered 298 Calvinists, which are the Presbyterians, and only 643 Roman Catholic priests. But Catholicism was and still is a minority religion in the UK, so that's not that numerical difference is not all that surprising. Okay. All right, no, skip that. So Bavaria, which is the southern part of Germany, the population was 70% Catholic, and yet it contributed over 500,000 soldiers to the German army, and the number of Catholic priests from Bavaria alone was 189 priests. So imagine that just from one state. So Germany's the size of Montana. So imagine one county in Montana, offering 100. So okay. I'll skip all that. Oh, the issue, as you might think, is later wars. Is there'd be the conscientious objector, pacifist movement, anti-war movement. In 1914, when the First World War began, I'm not going to say that was entirely absent, that it didn't exist at all, but it was a tiny, minute, because none of the belligerents on either side thought that the First World War was going to turn into what it did. As previous wars in the 19th century had been over in a few weeks or a few months at most. The longest, since Napoleon's fall, that where the fighting actually occurred in Europe was the Franco-Prussian War, and that was just a little over a year. So they didn't, that even those who thought the war was a bad idea, they thought, okay, well, it'll be over soon, and then we'll have a resolution. So they didn't know what the carnage that was going to come. So that, however, because of the way the First World War unfolded, and the appalling casualties, there did develop by the end an anti-war movement. And that really never left the West, Europe or the United States. All right, in Russia. Russia, when the war started, was still a monarchy, and it was allied with England and France. Now, Russia did have an established church, not the Catholic, but the Russian Orthodox Church, in which 87% of Russian men and 91% of Russian women regularly participated in the sacramental life of the Russian Orthodox Church, and that's by attending Mass and going to communion. And it was had established status, so the government provided clergy for the army. That ended in February of 1917, when the Bolsheviks. Well, not in February. So there were two Russian revolutions in 1917. The first was in February, which was just an anti-monarchical revolution. It was like a parliamentary. They wanted to eliminate the monarchy, but they kept Russia in the war, and so the army wouldn't support them. So then the the Bolshevik Revolution occurred 8 months later, in October of 1917, and that the Bolsheviks derives from the Marxist idea, which is overtly atheist. So of course there was no established church anymore. And then the Bolshevik, the Red Army, the Communist Army after 1917 was openly hostile to all forms of religion and actively persecuted. Okay, so that's for religion. The U.S. involvement in the First World War was precipitated by the sinking by a German submarine of the Lusitania, a ship, the Lusitania. Not an American ship, however, 128 Americans were on board. 1,198 were killed, and of those 128 were American citizens. So the U.S. involvement in the war lasted from April 6th, 1917, through the armistice, November 11th, 1918. 5 million personnel were mobilized to fight in the United States, and that's out of a U.S. population at the time was a third of what it is today. There was 105 million, according to the last census that had occurred before the war was 1910. So there were 105 million people in the United States. Of the 5 million who were mobilized, 2 million were actually sent over to Europe. And 116,000 of the Americans, 116,000 out of the 2 million died. Americans died. And that was complicated by the influenza, which occurred in the last year of the war, 1918. And 43,000 American soldiers in Europe. 43,000 of the 2 million American soldiers in Europe died of the influenza, in addition to the 116,000 who died in combat. Of the total, there were 38 million deaths in the First World War. Across the whole world, because when the countries that had colonies, when they fought, then their colonies also fought. So the total was 38 million, which, as appalling as that is, that's half of how many died in the Second World War. In the United States, there were, of course, the immigrant issue that they not only Catholics, but there were immigrants from all the countries who came. So that now they. Their homes of origin, in some cases, if they're recent immigrants, their families are still there. So they might have family members fighting them on both sides, but then, okay, so what do you do? And one issue in particular is the Germans. Because the Germans, because of the Schlieffen Plan, when you had this conflict between Austria and Serbia, and then out of nowhere, from the perspective of the average person, Germany attacks Belgium. And then attacks France. So Germany was perceived as the bad guys in this. And as the casualties of the war mounted, then the blame, commensurately increased. And there were many, there were many Germans, who were actually born in Germany and immigrated, that were there. And many of those were Catholics, because, the Lutherans in Germany did not make life easy for the Catholics. So many of the Germans who came were Catholic, and so they're caught in the middle. President Wilson, the U.S. president at the time, after he broke his word, he was reelected on a anti-war platform. Yet he got us in the war anyway. And when he went before Congress and got them to declare war on Germany, the American bishops, well, they spoke at the time through the archbishops. There were only 14 archbishops at the time, and the senior being Cardinal Gibbons of Baltimore. He was not officially the primate of the country, as in, because there was no established church, but he was the archbishop of the first diocese in the United States. So he had been there for so long, and he was known. He was like the recognized voice of the Catholic hierarchy in the U.S. He wrote a letter to Wilson, and it was an open letter, so it was published in the newspapers of the day, which read in part, quote, "We are all," meaning Catholics, in that, "we are all true Americans, ready, as our age, our ability, and our conditions will permit, to do whatsoever is in us to do for the preservation, the progress, and the triumph of our beloved country." End quote. In retrospect, we can identify this 1917 as the beginning of a coherent, intentionally unified, and organized participation in large-scale national activities by Catholics organized on a national scale. So the Liberty Loan drives I mentioned in the previous video, those were supported by the bishops. Red Cross drives. Red Cross is a humanitarian organization, but not specifically Catholic. Nevertheless, many Catholic bishops supported it. The Ancestor to the United Way, which was the United War, UWW, United War Work. The war stamp sales, war-saving stamp sales, and Catholics participated in all these and actively promoted, by the bishops, even though, they're fighting against at least one completely Catholic country in Austria-Hungary. Excuse me. Allergies. So the national organization of Catholics participating in larger secular national organizations in support of the war effort brings us to the Knights of Columbus. So the Knights of Columbus had been established in the late 19th century by an Irish immigrant priest in the Archdiocese of Hartford, Connecticut. It was a lay organization. His name, Father McGivney. His name was Father McGivney. He lost his father. Both of his parents were Irish immigrants, and he lost his father when he was very young, and he saw what that did, to the family, the hardships, and they couldn't even afford to, give him a decent burial. So the Knights of Columbus started as a burial society, where the members who would join, they'd pay dues, and some was always kept, so that whenever one of their members died, the family would not have to come up with the money right there for the burial. Plus, they would help. They'd provide help for the widow, and the orphans if there were still young children. So from the burial society idea, it grew to an insurance, to provide, not just for that, but security, insurance for security, and then from there, since it was an organization of Catholic laymen, and all the units had a priest as a chaplain, but they still laymen, and they're patriotic. That's one of the the Knights of Columbus is part of what one of the things is patriotism. So this war effort caused them to think of themselves in national terms, to organize 4 national drives, and so the Knights of Columbus became. It wasn't McGivney couldn't have envisioned this in the late 19th century, but it became. It provided a template for the first national Catholic organization focused on a particular objective, in this case the war effort. And as it turns out, in retrospect, it never went away. The Knights are still active, but there are also other Catholic organizations modeled themselves on that. So, okay. Done. During the First World War, the KCs, the Knights of Columbus, organized, spearheaded, initiated much of the Catholic service effort during the war. Initially, they were providing care packages, as we'd say, for the soldiers, recreational facilities, chaplains, both on stateside for the guys who were being trained, and then as well as overseas. So they provide religious, social, and recreational services. And at the time when we first entered the war, the bishops did not have a national organization to do this. So the bishops were, that they were in a sense relying on that. The only national, or to the extent that it was one, the only national gatherings of Catholic bishops that occurred were only among the 14 archbishops. So, and that was just, they decided, okay, we'll get together in this city and talk about these points and then go back home. But seeing with, once it was clear the war was not going to, by the time the United States got in the war in 1917, it was obvious that it had already been going on since 1914. So there were a number of civic-minded, nationally-minded, organizationally-minded Catholics who came together to discuss what to do. One of them was John J. Burke, another Lewis O'Hearn, and another was, both of them were a Paulist priest. And a third was a layman named William Kirby. He was on the faculty of Catholic University teaching sociology. And it also happened, coincidentally, that the U.S. Commissioner of Labor in Wilson's government was a Catholic layman. His name was Charles P. O'Neill. So under their leadership and modeled on the Knights of Columbus organization, they came together in the same year, 1917, to create the National Catholic War Council, the NCWC. And John Burke was elected to be, the organization, not CEO. I mean, they wouldn't have called it that then, but it essentially was the chief executive officer. And this marked the first national commitment to social and political action. So they were like placing themselves organizationally above the Knights of Columbus. So the Knights of Columbus was its own organization that was doing their own things. And this was the NCWC, the National Catholic War Council Conference, put themselves above that because their hope was that the Knights of Columbus would be only one among many such national organizations that they would create. Okay, so keep that in mind. And I mention all this, seminarians, because the current U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops began with this. So the NCWC, then became the NCCB, then became the USCCC, then the USCCB. So it never went away. That's the point. Okay. All right. February 12th, 1915. This is not a specifically Catholic thing, but just to have some other milestones from American history. The cornerstone for the Lincoln Memorial was laid in Washington, D.C. in 1915. All right, February 1917, the Romanov dynasty in Russia was overthrown by Russian nationalists who were anti-monarchical, but resolved to continue the war. And then, as I said, that doomed them. In October, the Russians were still using the old calendar. They had not adopted the Orthodox calendar. So, October, November, so Red October, that on the Orthodox calendar it was October, but according to the Julian calendar it was November. But it was the same year in 1917. And the communists remained in control of Russia until 1991, when the Soviet Union fell. All right, as we said, April 6, 1917, the United States entered the war allied to the UK, France, and Italy. Same year, August 1st, 1917, Pope Benedict XV, who was officially neutral, he sent a letter to all the leaders of all the countries involved in the war on all sides with a proposal containing 7 points as a basis for a negotiated peace, which he offered to host. So point 1, that everyone would agree that morality, not military power, would be the basis for this negotiated settlement. Point 2, prior agreement would be required. So it's stipulated as a precondition for negotiation that anybody who would come would previously agree to multilateral, universal, that everybody would disarm, reduce their military to a level below that required to engage in a foreign war. That everybody would reduce their military to the point of just basic self-defense, like a Coast Guard and a National Guard, but not enough to go to a foreign war. Third, agreement to international arbitration of future disputes between the powers in order to prevent such a war occurring again. Point 4, universal agreement to freedom of the seas. Now that meant, in their context, an end to submarine warfare. Now, the way we use the term freedom of the seas today, it has a lot more connotations with regard to trade now, but in their connotation, it meant an end to submarine warfare. That it would like be outlawed. Submarine warfare would just be outlawed. Fifth, as a precondition to attending these negotiations, that whoever attended would up front renounce. That they would say up front that they were not going to demand any reparations from any other power. No indemnity, as they called it then. Sixth, they all agreed, prior agreement, that the independence of all territory that was conquered and occupied during the war would be evacuated, like it would be freed again. Seventh, that all those who agree to those preconditions, then at this meeting, they would examine the territorial claims of all the peoples involved with an eye toward national self-determination. We covered that in previous videos, that each ethnic group, some were part of larger empires. Some had been conquered long before by Russia, Austria-Hungary, Germany. The idea of national self-determination, that each ethnic group would have its own political independence, essentially have its own country. Now, this was not the first time Pope Benedict had offered to mediate peace, but it was the first time after the United States entered the war. Germany and Austria refused. They declined the invitation because this occurred after, so the Romanovs had fallen in Russia, and they were on the opposite side. So the Romanovs had fallen earlier that year. So the Romanovs fell in February of 17, and this was in August of 17. So they believed that they were winning. Germany and Austria thought they were just going to straight up win the war, so they didn't have to negotiate. England and France refused the invitation because the Americans were in the war. This was August of 17, and the prior April, the United States entered the war. So they thought, okay, they're going to win. Now they're going to win, so they don't need to negotiate a settlement. They're going to win and be able to take everything they want. The American president, Woodrow Wilson, was Presbyterian by religion, of the virulently anti-Catholic variety. He spurned the Pope's suggestions as being presumptuous for a neutral religious leader to make to leaders of nations. Yet, Wilson incorporated many of the Pope's points into his own later 14-point plan, which did become the basis for final peace negotiations. Naturally, of course, Wilson never acknowledged that he had taken these suggestions from the Pope. Okay, the NCWC, the National Catholic War Conference. I mentioned earlier the background for its organization. So it actually came together and started meeting in person. August 11th, 1917. This was the Catholic hierarchy, the bishops. They met on the campus of Catholic University of America, which is still there on its original site in Brookland in the District of Columbia. And their purpose was to coordinate activities such as sending care packages, letter writing to the troops, selling Liberty bonds, recruiting Catholic priests to serve as chaplains, because the United States Army and Navy hadn't really solidified how they were going to do that yet. In addition to the guys I already mentioned, Father John Burke, Father Lewis O'Hearn, and the lay guys, there was another priest named Father John Augustine Ryan. He was a priest of the Archdiocese of St. Paul, Minnesota. He had studied at Catholic University, done his doctoral dissertation on a just wage. So his focus was economics. He was selected at this first meeting to be the chair of the Social Action Committee of the NCWC, the National Catholic War Council. In that position, he absorbed some elements, or he brought with him some elements of the secular progressive movement, which we already talked about, and infused them into the thinking of the American Catholic hierarchy. Within this context, the first time that they're coming together intentionally as a hierarchy to organize national initiatives in the midst of a national crisis. And so the reputation that later that the American Catholic hierarchy would get of being on the liberal side, it derives from this. And that would continue to shape at least the public statements of the American bishops. Now, as we'll see, there are many bishops who disagreed, thought it was that they were, being suborned by socialism and communism. But as far as official policy, so here's a few examples. First, reconciliation of the American and the Roman traditions, rooted in Hecker's, Father Isaac Hecker, the founder of Americanism, who was deceased by this point, but his ideas remain. Rooted in Hecker's assumption that the United States, even though officially secular, and Roman Catholicism were not by nature irreconcilable. It's obvious they were not the same thing, but Hecker always believed that the two were not by nature opposed, that they could cooperate, not just agree to be separate, but that they could actively find ways, that there were enough things, say if you list 100 things that were important to each of them, that of those, maybe 30 they would share in common. And so they could cooperate on those 30 things and then just leave the other 70 things to each do separately. Second, the American founding fathers and the Catholic Church tradition shared an intellectual foundation, that foundation being the natural law, capitalized, the natural law. And we covered that, seminarians, as far back as the first year course, the patristics course in antiquity. With the Stoicism, that is the idea that the universe, that the prime mover created the universe with internally consistent laws, and so that once one understood the laws of nature, then one could formulate the laws of society in accord with that to achieve the best possible results. So not only obvious law, physical laws like gravity, but that there are also moral laws that are situations in which it is always and everywhere the case that in certain situations the human person is going to flourish. Conversely, there are always and everywhere certain situations in which the human person will be diminished. And that's because of the natural law. So, the assertion of Ryan influencing the NCWC and its birth was based on this assertion that the American founding fathers, even only one of the signers of the Declaration was Catholic, Charles Carroll, which we covered earlier in this playlist. Even though only one was Catholic, they were all they were all Enlightenment rationalists, which means they all accepted the natural law. All right, third, the social problems of the country and the world, many of which we covered. We had labor violence, we had racist, we had slavery, we had racist. I mean, there are many the social problems. So the NCWC, and it will assert, the bishops will assert, that all of these social problems are, looking at the deepest reality of them, were moral problems, not just economic problems. They had economic effects, they had economic causes, but they were not exclusively economic problems. They were moral issues. So that the church has an obligation to be involved. Fourth, government intervention for the purpose of ameliorating social problems, social ills, was justified in the eyes of and approved, they believed, approved by Pope Leo XIII's encyclical Rerum Novarum. And so the bishops of that mindset, following Father John Augustine Ryan's reasoning, asserted that the Catholic Church in the United States had an obligation to promote and support government intervention in order to ameliorate, deal with, solve, however you want to phrase it, these social ills that had economic causes and effects, but at their heart were moral problems. Fifth, Father Ryan's personal background, meaning his intellectual, his own formation, was a synthesis, was a blending in his own mind of the rural populist tradition, is Eastern Minnesota, with the populism, at least in its origin in the 19th century, was a rural farmer movement. The rights of rural farmers. Progressivism, which was a city thing, it was primarily a city, urban phenomenon with workers' rights, women's rights, general humanity, children's rights, labor rights, with Catholic traditions. So he did not see a contradiction with any of those. Now, as we'll see that some bishops did, as they saw some of this, the government, the state get involved, they saw that as socialist and feared it because the examples of socialism they saw in the world were atheist. Sixth, Father Ryan consistently followed the secular progressive pattern of redefining the meaning of the Republic's founding documents in terms of an idealized democracy, a democracy in which a strong central government not only could, but was morally obliged to regularly intervene and manage the social, economic, and moral order for the sake of the common good. All right. So you can see how some would accuse him of socialism, or some that really hated him of communism. But this is essential, seminarians. So this is the beginning of the National Organization of Bishops, which is still with us. It has a different name, but it has its headquarters in D.C., just like this. It's not on the campus of Catholic University. It's across the street. So, so this idea that, the church becoming allies with the government, like the church never had established status in the United States. But the idea of the church promoting government intervention and actually seeking to help this government intervention for the sake of achieving moral and social change, such as the labor rights, the voting rights, education rights, later would be health care, all that. But the RIF developed here too. Not only the initiative, the national initiative developed here, but the RIF developed here too, because right at the beginning, some of the bishops, as it turns out a numerical minority, but still significant, saw this as socialism, saw labor unions as socialism, and all legislation to that effect. They saw that as socialism and therefore feared it and opposed it, whereas others saw it as the best and most efficient way to achieve the common good, 1918, April 5th. The influenza pandemic erupts in the in the world. It was, certainly up to that point, the most severe pandemic in human history. Now, since COVID, and I'm not going to get into that because I know there's if you research the COVID numbers, there's all kind of divergence on. Anyway, but it's certainly severe. It was caused by an H1N1 virus with genes of avian origin. Although there is not, at least in the sources I've read, and there are plenty of them, there is not universal consensus regarding where it originated. It is a fact that it did spread worldwide during 1918 and 1919. In the United States, it was first identified in military personnel in April of 1915. It's estimated that 500 million people, which was 1/3 of the world's population at the time, became infected with the bird flu. The number of deaths is estimated to be around 50 million worldwide. That's with of those 50 million, 675,000 died in the United States. Mortality was high in people younger than 5 years old, those between 20 to 40 years old, and those 65 years and older. The high mortality rate in healthy young people between the ages of 20 and 40 was a noteworthy, I won't say unique, because it wasn't the only time that happened in history, but it was certainly a noteworthy feature of that pandemic. So a few dates. April 5th, 1918. No, excuse me. April 1917, the U.S. enters the First World War. June of 1917, a draft was established to increase the number of soldiers in the Army, the American Army. To accommodate this rapid increase in numbers, the U.S. Army established 32 training camps, each housing between 25,000 and 55,000 soldiers. So that's the background. In April of 1918, 1 year after we officially declared our entrance into the war, is the first mention of influenza appearing in a public health report dated April 5th. That report recorded 18 severe cases of influenza. And of those 18, 3 had already died. That health report was written in Haskell, Kansas, the state of Kansas. Haskell, Haskell. Following month, March of 1918, more than 100 soldiers at Fort Riley in Kansas became ill with the flu. Within a week, the number of influenza cases quintupled. Sporadic flu activity spread in the United States, Europe, Asia over the next 6 months. September 1918, the second wave of influenza emerged within the borders of the United States at Camp Devens outside of Boston. It was a training camp. Between September and November, a second wave of influenza peaked in the U.S. That second wave had even a higher mortality rate and was responsible for most of the deaths attributed to the influenza. In that same period, between September and November of 1918, New York City's Board of Health added influenza to the list of reportable diseases, and it has remained so, and that became a national practice. And it imposed quarantine, all flu cases, to be isolated at home or in a city hospital quarantine unit. By the end of September, more than 14,000 influenza cases were reported at Camp Devens alone, outside of Boston. That was a fourth of the total guys in the camp. January 1919, a third wave of influenza occurred, killing many more people. April 1919, This is anticipating, but this is after the war ended in 1918. So April of 1919, the peace conference was held at Versailles outside of Paris. And at that conference, Woodrow Wilson collapsed. And some historians speculate that he had been weakened that he actually had contracted influenza and become weakened from it, which was because it was spreading. It was in Paris itself. Now, Versailles is outside of Paris, but, still, people travel on the trains. The other theory about, now it is known that later in his term he had strokes. So, one school of thought is that this was a early minor stroke, in the sense that he was still able to function, and that later ones would render him, it would be much more severe. But another theory is that he actually contracted influenza, and that, coupled with all the stress of the negotiations and the travel, made him vulnerable to the strokes. Okay. October 10th, 1918. Federal Education Bill. So the war is still officially going on. The armistice was signed the following month, November of 18. But this is domestic policy, but it is going to affect the church. So on October 10th, 1918, a senator from Georgia named Hoke Smith, yes, Hoke, his first name, Hoke Smith, introduced the Federal Education Bill, which took the Blair Amendment that we covered in the 19th century to its logical legislative conclusion by proposing the creation of a federal Department of Education. Its companion was introduced in the House of Representatives by H.M. Towner, Towner, state of Iowa. So the legislation was discussed and referred to in the newspapers of the day as the Smith-Towner Bill. But that is the Federal Education Bill. So this revived all the old issues, the 19th century issues we covered, into a new generation of political leaders. The issues of state versus federal rights in terms of education, which we covered as far back as 1830. The rights of parents versus the rights of government to decide if and how their children should be educated. Secular versus religious concepts of human formation, not just education and reading, writing, and math, but the whole just bringing a child from childhood to adulthood. Fourth, the abiding Catholic fear that a public school, given the demographics of the day, would in reality be a Protestant school, masquerading behind the veneer of official neutrality. All right, ever since the second Ku Klux Klan had been formed in Stone Mountain, Georgia in 1915 by William J. Simmons, there had been an emerging national momentum against the existence of Catholic schools. There were many, even outside of the radical element that was drawn to the Klan, but there were many who viewed religious schools, not just Catholics. I mean, our interest is Catholicism, obviously because I'm a priest, but it wasn't just, it was against the idea of religious education or sectarian education, as they would have said then. So there were those nationalists, American nationalists, viewed any religious school as by its nature separatist, and they condemned such separatism as unpatriotic and un-American. This momentum was expressed by state initiatives pushing the Blaine Amendment from the 19th century, from when Grant was president. The Blaine Amendment, if you remember, would tax church property. And combined with the Bennett Amendment from Wisconsin, also in the 19th century, which required compulsory school attendance for certain age kids. The Bennett Amendment, it was ages 6 to 16. With the added stipulation that requirement could only be fulfilled by attending public schools, government schools. These initiatives, these three initiatives, so combining the Blaine Amendment to tax church property, the Bennett Amendment requiring compulsory attendance at schools for children between ages 6 and 16, and stipulating that education could only be done in a public school, occurred in California, Wyoming, Texas, Arkansas, Nevada, Oklahoma, Ohio, Oregon, Wisconsin, and right here in Louisiana. So from 1980, jump out of the chronology for a moment, just in case I forget to talk about it later. It failed initially. However, the idea never went away. So a Federal Bureau of Education was finally created in 1939 when FDR was president. It became a cabinet post in 1953 when the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare was created. And that's when Eisenhower was president. In 1979, when Jimmy Carter was president, the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare was divided into two cabinet posts. One was the Department of Education. The other was the Department of Health and Human Services. Okay, the armistice was signed to end the armistice. Just means stand to arms, stand arms. So it's not a peace treaty, but it just means instead of aiming the weapons at each other, that you stand, you hold it, and you're ready to fight. But it's a ceasefire. So that occurred on November 11th, which in the United States is still a Veterans Day. The Kaiser, Wilhelm II, had abdicated on November 9th. So he hoped to save the dynasty that way. That he would take the blame. He would abdicate, and then his son, he thought, could pick up the pieces and would still, so the dynasty would still survive. But that didn't happen. And then it was a new civilian government that signed the armistice on November 11th, and that was only 7 days after the influenza spread among the soldiers in the trenches. Okay. Let's see how long we've been going. Okay, we'll stop here. And then next, we'll move into the peace and the effects of that. There's many decisions that took place at the Treaty of Versailles and what they did, dividing up the world, made the Second World War inevitable in some form or another, and also created a situation like drew the borders of the current Middle East, and we're still dealing with it. So we'll pick up that in the next video. So for now, thank you for your attention. This session is adjourned.